No, that's a clear line. A creditor of the corporation, no matter how much they're owed or how badly they think the company is being run, generally cannot bring a derivative action. That right is reserved exclusively for shareholders, acting in their capacity as owners on behalf of the entity they own a part of. And this whole distinction really raises that important question, doesn't it? Why does the law make such a sharp distinction between direct and derivative suits? It fundamentally boils down to whose rights are being primarily vindicated, the individual shareholder's personal rights as an owner, or the corporation's rights as a separate legal entity. Getting this distinction right is absolutely make or break in any legal challenge involving shareholder litigation. It determines who has standing to sue, what procedures they must follow, like the demand requirement, and critically, who receives the benefit of any recovery. For anyone trying to master corporate law, particularly for an exam, being able to quickly identify the nature of the injury and who ultimately benefits from the lawsuit is your guiding star for classifying the action correctly.
We've talked a lot throughout this discussion about that legal shield that corporations and LLCs, too, are supposed to provide. That core promise of limited liability, the idea that the owners, the shareholders or members, are generally only at risk for the amount of money they've invested in the company, and their personal assets are safe from the company's debts or liabilities. But is that shield always impenetrable? Can creditors or other claimants ever break through it and hold the shareholders personally liable for the corporation's obligations?
That's the million-dollar question, and it leads us directly to the important, albeit exceptional, doctrine of piercing the corporate veil. You're right, shareholders generally enjoy that golden promise of limited liability. It's a primary reason people choose to incorporate in the first place. They risk their investment, but typically not their personal wealth. However, this protective corporate veil, the legal separation between the corporation and its owners, can, in limited and fairly extreme circumstances, be disregarded or pierced by a court.
Pierced by a court. Under what circumstances? Is it just because the company went bankrupt?
No, definitely not, just because the company failed or can't pay its debts. Piercing the corporate veil is an equitable remedy, meaning it's based on principles of fairness and is applied at the court's discretion when the corporate form is being abused. Courts use it as a tool to prevent fraud or achieve justice when maintaining the separate legal identity of the corporation would lead to an unfair result. They typically look at the totality of the circumstances to determine if the corporation is not really being treated as a separate entity, but rather as the shareholder's personal alter ego or a mere facade for a dominant shareholder's personal dealings.
Okay, so it's not automatic, it's equitable, and it's about abuse of the corporate form. What are the specific red flags or factors that would make a court seriously consider piercing that veil and holding individual shareholders personally liable for the corporation's debts? What kind of abuse are we talking about?
Courts look for a number of factors, and usually it's not just one factor, but a combination of them that leads to piercing. Some of the most common red flags, the ones you should always be looking for in a fact pattern, include 1. Undercapitalization of the corporation at the time of its formation. This means the corporation was started without enough capital or assets reasonably needed to conduct its intended business, essentially making it a risky shell from day one, almost set up to fail creditors. 2. Disregard of corporate formalities. This is a big one. Things like failing to hold required shareholder or board meetings, neglecting to keep separate corporate minutes and records, not issuing stock certificates properly, or failing to file required annual reports. These suggest the owners aren't respecting the corporation's separate identity. 3. Commingling of corporate and personal assets. This is where the owner treats the corporate bank account like the personal piggy bank, paying personal bills from it, or depositing corporate revenue into their personal account. There's no clear separation between the owner's money and the company's money.
Using the company checkbook for groceries.
Exactly that kind of thing. Also 4. Use of corporate assets for purely personal purposes without proper authorization, documentation, or repayment. 5. Self-dealing with the corporation on unfair terms, without following the proper procedures for conflict of interest transactions we discussed earlier. 6. Siphoning of corporate funds or stripping of corporate assets, especially done with the intent to leave the corporation unable to pay its creditors. 7. Using the corporate form specifically to avoid existing statutory requirements or other pre-existing legal obligations. And 8. Engaging in misleading, fraudulent, or otherwise wrongful dealings with a corporate creditor, essentially using the corporate form as a tool to perpetrate a fraud. When a court sees a pattern of these kinds of behaviors, indicating that the corporate form is being used unfairly or as a mere instrumentality of the shareholder, it's much more likely to conclude that equity requires disregarding the corporate entity and holding the responsible shareholder personally liable for the corporation's debt or obligation in that specific instance. They essentially lift the mask or pierce the veil of the corporation. It's most common in closely held corporations where the lines between owner and company can blur more easily.
That makes sense. It sounds like it's often about single dominant shareholders abusing the system in closely held companies. But what about shareholders who control a majority of a legitimate functioning corporation, maybe even a public one? Do they owe any special duties beyond the normal director duties, if they're also directors, specifically to the minority shareholders just because they hold that controlling power?
Yes, that's a very important point that goes beyond just veil piercing and applies even when the corporation is being run legitimately. A controlling shareholder, generally defined as an individual or a group acting together that holds enough shares, usually 50%, but sometimes less if control can be effectively exercised, to dominate corporate policy and decision-making, owes a fiduciary duty directly to the minority shareholders.
A fiduciary duty from one shareholder to another, when does that specifically kick in?
This duty becomes particularly relevant and is most often litigated in specific types of transactions where the controlling shareholder's actions can disproportionately affect the minority. Courts typically find this duty applies if the controlling shareholder is 1. Selling their controlling interest to an outsider, especially if they receive a control premium, a higher price per share than minority shareholders get, and don't take reasonable steps to ensure the buyer won't loot the company. 2. Involved in transactions that eliminate other shareholders from the corporation, like in a freeze-out or squeeze-out merger where the controller forces minority shareholders to sell their shares. Or 3, causing the corporation to pay a distribution or provide some benefit to the controlling shareholder that is denied to the other minority shareholders, effectively cutting them out of the company's value.
And what does that fiduciary duty require the controlling shareholder to do in those situations?
The scope of this fiduciary duty generally includes 2 key components. 1, the duty to disclose all material information that a reasonable minority shareholder would consider important in deciding how to vote on the transaction or whether to seek appraisal rights. And 2, the duty of fair dealing, which often requires demonstrating that the transaction was substantively fair, fair price, and procedurally fair, fair process, to the minority shareholders, especially in freeze-out situations. They can't just use their controlling power to operate purely in their own self-interest when their actions uniquely impact the minority. Their power comes with an added responsibility to treat the minority fairly.
Wow. Okay, so the corporate shield, while powerful, is clearly not invincible. It can be pierced for abuse, and even controlling shareholders have duties to the minority. This really paints a picture of a dynamic entity with inherent risks and responsibilities. But what about when a corporation needs to undergo a more fundamental change to its very structure, or even cease to exist altogether? How do major transitions like mergers, acquisitions, or dissolution happen legally?
Right? Corporations, despite sometimes seeming like permanent fixtures, are dynamic. They evolve, they combine with others, they change shape, and sometimes they simply come to an end. These major transformations, mergers, acquisitions, dissolutions involve very specific, legally mandated procedures. These rules are designed primarily to ensure fairness and provide necessary protections to all the stakeholders involved, particularly the shareholders, whose ownership rights are being altered, and the creditors, whose claims need to be handled properly.
Let's start with combining companies. I hear the terms merger and acquisition used a lot, sometimes interchangeably. How do they actually differ legally, and what kind of approvals do they typically need?
They are distinct legal processes, though the business outcome can sometimes look similar. A merger is the statutory combination of 2 or more corporations, such that only one corporation survives as a legal entity, and the other corporation legally cease to exist, with their assets and liabilities automatically transferring by operation of law to the surviving corporation. Think of Company A merging into Company B. Company A disappears, and Company B continues, now owning everything that belonged to both A and B.
And approval for a merger.
A standard statutory merger typically requires approval from both the board of directors and the shareholders of each corporation involved in the merger. Usually, a majority vote of the shareholders entitled to vote is required at a meeting where a quorum, a majority of voting shares, is present for each company.
Okay, merger involves both sides approving. What about an asset acquisition? How is that different?
An asset acquisition is different because the corporate entities themselves don't legally combine. Instead, one corporation, the acquirer, purchases substantially all, or maybe just a significant part, of the assets of another corporation, the seller or transferor. The selling corporation continues to exist legally, at least initially, though it may just be a shell holding the cash proceeds from the sale.
What about approvals for an asset sale? Is it the same as a merger?
The approval procedure is similar in that board and shareholder votes are often required, except typically only the selling corporation's board and shareholders need to approve the sale of substantially all its assets. The acquiring company's board usually approves the purchase, but its shareholders generally don't get a vote unless the acquisition is being financed by issuing a large amount of new stock, for instance. A key point here is that, unlike a merger, the selling corporation generally remains liable for its own debts and liabilities unless the acquiring company specifically agrees contractually to assume them. The liabilities don't automatically transfer with the assets.
And a stock acquisition.
A stock acquisition is simply when one corporation buys enough stock in another corporation, the target, to gain control over it, often acquiring it directly from the target's shareholders. This can be done through a tender offer to the public shareholders or private negotiations. The target corporation generally remains a separate legal entity, but it's now controlled by the acquiring company, often operating as a subsidiary. Shareholder votes of the acquiring company usually aren't required unless, again, they're issuing a lot of stock to pay for the acquisition. The target shareholders obviously vote by deciding whether or not to sell their shares.
Okay, those are major changes. What if I'm a shareholder in a company that's about to merge or sell all its assets and I don't like the deal? Maybe I think the price offered for my shares is way too low, or I just fundamentally object to the transaction. Am I just forced to go along with the majority, or do I have a way out?
In many situations involving major corporate changes like mergers or sales of substantially all assets, dissenting shareholders often have a powerful statutory remedy called dissenters' rights, also commonly known as appraisal rights. If a shareholder is entitled to vote on the transaction and they object to it, these rights may allow them to force the corporation to buy back their shares at a fair value as determined by a court through an appraisal process, rather than accepting the merger consideration or the outcome of the asset sale.
Force the company to buy me out at fair value. How does that work?
The shareholder has to follow a very strict technical statutory procedure to perfect their appraisal rights. Typically, they must: 1. Deliver written notice to the corporation before the shareholder vote on the transaction, stating their intent to demand payment. 2. They must not vote in favor of the proposed action. They must abstain or vote no. And 3, after the action is approved by the majority, they must make a prompt written demand on the corporation for payment of the fair value of their shares. If the shareholder and corporation can't agree on the fair value, the court will determine it, often after hearing expert valuation testimony. It's their legally mandated exit strategy when they fundamentally disagree with where the majority is taking the company in these major transactions.
So companies can merge, acquire, and transform, and shareholders have some rights there, but companies can also just end, cease to exist entirely. How does a corporation voluntarily decide to close up shop, dissolve itself, and what happens to its assets and debts then?
That process is called voluntary dissolution. The procedure depends on whether the corporation has really gotten off the ground yet. Before any stock has been issued or the corporation has commenced business, it may typically be voluntarily dissolved by a simple majority vote of the incorporators or the initial directors named in the articles. It's simpler at that early stage.
And after it's up and running, with shareholders.
After stock has been issued, voluntary dissolution is a more significant corporate act that requires broader consensus. Typically, the board of directors must first adopt a proposal recommending dissolution, and then that proposal must be submitted to the shareholders for approval, usually requiring a majority vote of all outstanding shares entitled to vote.
Once it's approved, does the corporation just vanish instantly?
No, it doesn't just vanish. Once dissolution is authorized, the corporation typically files articles of dissolution with the state, but its existence continues for a limited purpose: to wind up its affairs. During this winding up period, the dissolved corporation can continue to exist to: 1. Collect its remaining assets. 2. Dispose of any property it owns that won't be distributed directly to shareholders. 3. Pay off or make adequate provision for discharging all of its liabilities and obligations. And 4. Distribute any remaining property among its shareholders according to their respective rights and interests, like liquidation preferences for preferred stock, then pro rata for common stock.
How exactly are those assets distributed during winding up? Is there a specific order of priority? Who gets paid first? This seems critical for creditors.
Absolutely critical. The directors overseeing the winding up must follow a strict statutory order of distribution for the corporation's assets. They must first pay, or make adequate provision to pay, all creditors of the corporation. This includes bondholders, lenders, suppliers, employees owed wages, tax authorities, everyone the corporation owes money to. Creditors come first. Only after all creditor claims are satisfied or provided for can assets be distributed to shareholders. Among shareholders, those holding stock with preferences in liquidation, typically preferred stock, get paid next, up to the amount of their preference. Finally, whatever's left over, if anything, is distributed to the holders of the other stock, typically common shareholders, usually on a pro rata basis according to the number of shares they own. Directors who distribute assets to shareholders before satisfying creditors can face personal liability.
Okay, that covers voluntary dissolution. What about if a corporation doesn't want to dissolve, but someone else, maybe a disgruntled shareholder or a creditor who isn't getting paid, tries to force it to shut down through the courts?
That's involuntary dissolution, also sometimes called judicial dissolution, and it's a court-ordered remedy granted only in specific circumstances. A creditor can typically pursue involuntary dissolution, but usually only if they can show their claim has been reduced to a judgment, the judgment is unsatisfied, and the corporation is insolvent. It's a remedy of last resort for creditors.
What about shareholders? Can they seek involuntary dissolution more easily?
Shareholders generally have broader grounds to seek involuntary dissolution, often reflecting serious internal dysfunction, deadlock, or abuse by those in control. Common statutory grounds allow a shareholder to petition a court for dissolution if they can prove 1. The corporate assets are being misapplied or wasted. 2. The directors or those in control are acting illegally, oppressively, or fraudulently. 3. The directors are deadlocked in the management of corporate affairs. The shareholders are unable to break the deadlock, and irreparable injury to the corporation is threatened or being suffered as a result. Or 4. The shareholders themselves are deadlocked in voting power, for example a 50-50 split, and have failed for a specified period, like 2 consecutive annual meetings, to elect successors to directors whose terms have expired.
That term oppressively sounds important, especially for minority shareholders.
It is. The ground based on oppressive conduct by directors or controlling shareholders is particularly significant, especially in closely held corporations. This shareholder oppression doctrine has been interpreted by many courts to protect the reasonable expectations of minority shareholders in these smaller companies. Expectations about things like having a job with a company, receiving a return on investment, or having some say in management, which might have been part of the implicit bargain when they invested. If the controlling shareholders act in a way that unfairly frustrates those reasonable expectations, a court might find the conduct oppressive and, in extreme cases, order dissolution, or often a less drastic remedy, like a forced buyout of the minority shareholders' shares. And if you step back and look at all these mechanisms, mergers, acquisitions, appraisal rights, voluntary and involuntary dissolution, it really demonstrates that even these seemingly permanent corporate entities have a defined life cycle governed by law. There are very specific legal requirements for their transformation, combination, or winding down. It's a complex choreography involving board duties, shareholder rights, creditor protections, and court oversight, all designed to ensure that even when a corporation undergoes fundamental change or ceases to exist, the process unfolds with a degree of fairness and legal order. These are all high-stakes areas in legal practice, and consequently, they are prime topics for examination. #tech, #VV. Special corporate forms and the rise of the LLC.
We've covered the traditional corporation in a ton of detail, its birth, its governance, its major life changes, even its potential death. But my understanding is that not all corporations are cut from the exact same cloth. There are variations designed for specific needs or purposes, and beyond corporations, there are also increasingly popular alternative business structures out there, right?
That's absolutely right. The standard corporate form, the C corporation, as it's often called for tax purposes, is the baseline. But the corporate structure itself is flexible and has been adapted over time to create specialized entities catering to particular needs, offering different governance models, or achieving specific tax outcomes. First, and very common, is the closed corporation, or closely held corporation. As we've touched on, this is characterized by having only a few shareholders, often individuals who know each other, maybe family members or business partners. Crucially, its stock is not publicly traded on an exchange. Because of this private nature, closed corporations often operate with a more relaxed, less formal style of governance compared to large public companies. State laws often allow them to dispense with certain formalities like formal board meetings, and shareholders might enter into agreements that dictate management more directly than at a public company. They function more like incorporated partnerships in some ways. Then we have the term foreign corporation. Now, this doesn't usually mean a corporation from another country. In U.S. state law, a foreign corporation is simply a corporation that was incorporated under the laws of